A little while ago I posted on the Pessimist Reddit page the idea that antinatalism isn't necessary as long as you've got basic pessimism. My thinking was that since pessimism already outlines life and the world and existence and so on as having negative value, it just stands to reason that if you were going to get ethical about it, reproduction under those circumstances would be the wrong thing to do, and that therefore there isn't any need of a particular ethical position like antinatalism when you've already got pessimism. The reaction I got was interesting enough for me to revise my thinking. I'm now thinking that it's antinatalism that doesn't need pessimism, at least as a base for drawing ethical conclusions. It might be possible to argue that antinatalism and pessimism can be separated. One interesting response to the post I made, from someone calling themselves Christian Cam, gave a few links to papers by the thinkers Gerald Harrison, Eric Magnuson and Stuart Rachels. Each have drawn the conclusion that it is morally wrong to reproduce from different starting premises. Harrison argued that a sense of duty demands not creating what he calls victims of the potential suffering of life, although he also states that his argument does not require us to acknowledge that life is a harm or that a world devoid of life is a good thing, i.e. the classic existential pessimist view. In another paper, he argued from the view of moral particularism, which is the view that you can't apply universal moral codes to all moral situations, which he admits would, on the face of it, clash with the moral absoluteness of antinatalism, but he also says that reproduction is in fact comparable with other morally wrong situations. I've got to admit I found that one tricky. Magnuson takes up from Benatar the risk-based argument, that is, creating people is taking a risk with those people's lives based on probabilities and possibilities. This is what's sometimes been called gambling with other people's lives, and while it does lean on the presence of suffering and inevitable death, it doesn't do so from an existential pessimist perspective. And Rachels calls his argument the famine relief argument, after Peter Singer's argument of the same name, in that the money cost of making and raising children would be, morally, better spent on relieving poverty elsewhere. That argument could be a more conditional antinatalist argument, since it doesn't seem to be saying that, if all things were economically equal, there'd be anything wrong with reproduction, and seems more directed at people with money than those without. But it is still an argument for antinatalism that once again isn't based on pessimism, and the paper lists pessimism as a reason for antinatalism, but claims the famine relief argument is not based on that. Now, I'm not claiming to agree with these arguments, fully understand them, or even be all that interested in them. My point here is that they show that it is possible to argue for antinatalism without having to resort to the good old life is suffering pessimist basis. If that is so, I'm suggesting that it could be possible to separate antinatalism from pessimism and have antinatalism not as something based on pessimism, but a range of other arguments that don't require a basic existential pessimist view of life. But it's an open question. As Conundrum wrote in response to the original post, I don't think antinatalism needs pessimism understood as the philosophical movement to function. I think antinatalism needs pessimism understood as a negative judgment of life and the world. Otherwise, there would be no motivation to say that bringing someone into existence into the world is bad and morally wrong. I would have thought that any overall assessment of the quality of life being negative enough to not want to create any more of it could at least be characterised as pessimist. But it might not necessarily mean the kind of classical, philosophical, existential pessimism that people mean when they refer to pessimism as a philosophy. It may mean that simply given the inevitability of suffering in the world, regardless of quality or quantity, and given an ethical imperative to not subject anyone to suffering, antinatalism is justifiable simply from such a position, which is not existential pessimism in itself. It's certainly true that antinatalism, as we understand it today, is derived from pessimism, or at least antinatal conclusions have, for some centuries now, so there's a long genealogy there. But antinatalism continues to be debated and rethought. There are many antinatalists who have, for example, started with veganism, which is not itself an existential pessimist ideology, by a long shot, and have basically applied their understanding of suffering derived from being vegan to antinatalism. By focusing on the presence of suffering, rather than the badness of life, one could still say that it is a classic existential pessimist move, since it values suffering over other phenomena. But at the same time, admitting that there is suffering in life isn't the same as saying life is suffering. But if one is to take an ethical position that one should avoid inflicting suffering as much as possible, not having kids is a basic way to do that. So can there be antinatalism that isn't based on existential pessimism? I think there is. Does that mean that antinatalism can finally part ways with pessimism? As someone shat with what antinatalism has been turned into, a vegan, utilitarian, effective, altruistic, extinctionist, pro-mortalist, basically do-gooder social justice identity bullshit, I'd prefer it. But as a pessimist, I don't expect it to happen. I just wanted to broach the idea.